After Sasha, the very idea felt like volunteering to have my ribs cracked open again, just to see if they'd heal differently this time. I was done. I was a boarded-up house, a ship deliberately run aground. My escape to Chloe's childhood home in the middle of nowhere was supposed to be a convalescence, a quiet place to lick my wounds and forget the particular shape of a woman's hand in mine, the specific cadence of a voice that could build you up and dismantle you in the same breath. I was here to become a ghost, to haunt the guest room and the back porch until I felt solid again. The house itself was a sprawling, comfortable creature of cedar and stone, nestled in a valley that seemed to collect silence. It smelled of old books and dried lavender, a scent I immediately associated with Chloe's mother, Eleanor. She moved through the rooms with a placid grace that felt like a direct rebuke to the frantic, buzzing anxiety that lived under my own skin. For the first 2 days, we'd been like ships passing in the night, our interactions limited to polite murmurs over coffee and shared smiles that didn't quite reach our eyes. I was the wounded stray her daughter had brought home, and she was the benevolent, distant keeper of the sanctuary. I was grateful for the space. It allowed me to exist without the pressure of performance. I could just be a collection of sore spots and quiet regrets, and no one would ask why. The third morning, I decided to brave the shower. The guest bathroom was an oasis of seafoam green tile and ridiculously plush towels. I let the hot water sluice over me for a long time, trying to wash away the phantom sensation of Sasha's fingers on my skin. I emerged, wrapped in a towel, feeling marginally more human. The air was thick with steam, clinging to the mirror and my hair. I'd forgotten to bring my clothes into the bathroom with me, a rookie mistake born of a mind that was still half somewhere else. I cracked the door, peering into the sun-drenched hallway. It was empty. Chloe had gone into town for groceries, her car crunching down the gravel driveway an hour ago. I assumed Eleanor was in her garden, a place she seemed to treat as a second home. Taking a deep breath, I slipped out of the bathroom and hurried across the hall to the guest room, the cool wood of the floorboards a shock against my bare feet. The door to my room was slightly ajar, just as I'd left it. I pushed it open and stepped inside, letting the towel drop to the floor. For a moment, I just stood there in the patch of sunlight warming the antique rug, my skin prickling as the air hit it. It was a fleeting, thoughtless moment of freedom, of being utterly alone in my own body. I turned to grab my clothes from the armchair where I'd left them, and that's when I saw her. Eleanor was standing in the doorway. Not entering, not leaving. Just standing. Her hand was resting on the doorknob, her knuckles white. She wasn't looking away, wasn't gasping in shock or stammering an apology. Her eyes, a startlingly clear shade of gray-green, were on me. They weren't leering or invasive. They were observant. They took in my bare shoulders, the curve of my spine, the scars from my appendectomy I was always vaguely self-conscious about. My entire body went rigid, a hot flush of shame crawling up my neck. I snatched the towel from the floor, clutching it to my chest like a shield. My heart hammered against my ribs, a frantic bird trapped in a cage. "I'm so sorry," I stammered, my voice a useless croak. I thought you were outside." Her expression didn't change, not immediately. The silence stretched, thick and suffocating. I expected her to flee, to close the door with a hasty apology, to make this moment as small and forgettable as possible. Instead, she took a slow breath, and her hand relaxed on the doorknob. A faint, almost imperceptible smile touched the corners of her mouth. It wasn't a smirk, it was something softer, something knowing. "The morning glories were wilting," she said, her voice calm and even, a low melody that did nothing to soothe my frantic pulse. I came back in for the watering can, her gaze finally lifted from my body to meet my eyes. There was no judgment there. No embarrassment. There was only an unnerving, profound stillness. It was as if she'd seen straight through the panic and the nakedness to the raw, frayed thing I was underneath. "It's all right, Maya," she said, and the quiet authority in her voice made the statement absolute. She held my gaze for another beat, a beat that lasted an eternity, before she gave a small nod and softly pulled the door closed, leaving me alone with the echo of her presence and the sudden, terrifying realization that I had been truly seen. I spent the rest of the morning in a state of suspended mortification. I dressed in the most concealing clothes I owned, a baggy sweater and loose jeans, despite the warmth of the day. It was ridiculous, a child's logic, as if covering my body now could somehow retroactively cover it then. Every creak of the floorboards in the hallway sent a fresh jolt of adrenaline through me. I was a cornered animal, convinced the predator was just outside my den. I replayed the moment in my head 1,000 times. The utter stillness of her. The lack of apology. The way her eyes had catalogued me, not with lust, but with a kind of quiet, intense focus that felt more intimate than any touch I'd ever known. Sasha had looked at me with possessive desire, with admiration, sometimes with anger. But no one had ever looked at me with such appraisal. As if I were a piece of art she was trying to understand. The thought was both terrifying and strangely compelling. I was hiding from the world, and this woman, my best friend's mother, had accidentally stumbled upon the one thing I couldn't hide, my own skin. Lunch was a trial. I came downstairs to find Chloe bustling around the kitchen, unloading groceries and chattering about the price of organic kale. Eleanor was at the sink, calmly washing lettuce leaves, her back to me. She wore a simple linen dress, and I could see the fine, strong muscles in her arms as she worked. Her hair was pinned up loosely, a few silvery strands escaping to curl at the nape of her neck. I found myself staring, my cheeks growing hot all over again. "There you are, sleepyhead," Chloe said, grinning at me. "Mom's making her famous chicken salad." "You're in for a treat," I offered a weak smile, my eyes darting to Eleanor. She turned, drying her hands on a towel, and met my gaze directly. There was no awkwardness in her expression, no hint of the morning's incident. "Hello, Maya," she said, her voice the same low, steady hum. "I hope you're hungry." It was so normal, so perfectly mundane, that it felt like a deliberate act of psychological warfare. She was refusing to acknowledge the electric charge that still lingered in the air between us. She was giving me an out, a chance to pretend it never happened. But her control only made my lack of it more apparent. I felt like a teenager with a crush, clumsy and transparent. "Starving," I managed to say, my voice sounding unnaturally high. I busied myself with setting the table, my movements jerky and uncertain. I was intensely aware of her every move. The soft scuff of her sandals on the terracotta floor. The way she reached for a bowl from a high shelf, the linen of her dress pulling taut across her back. The scent of lavender and something else, something earthy and green like tomato vines, that clung to her. We moved around the small island in the center of the kitchen, a careful, unspoken dance of avoidance. At one point, we both reached for the salt shaker at the same time. Her fingers brushed against mine. Her skin was cool and dry, the touch feather-light, but it sent a shockwave up my arm. I flinched back as if I'd been burned. "Sorry," I mumbled, staring at the wooden tabletop. She didn't say anything. She simply picked up the salt, her expression unreadable, and placed it on the counter near my plate. Chloe, oblivious, continued her monologue about a guy she'd run into at the market. And he had the audacity to ask me if I was still working at that little blog, as if I'm not a senior editor now. Honestly, the nerve. I made the appropriate noises of indignation, but my focus was entirely on the woman sitting across from me. Eleanor ate with a quiet deliberation, her gaze often drifting out the window to the sprawling garden beyond. She seemed to exist on a different plane of time, slower and more intentional than the rest of the world. I felt myself watching her hands, the way she held her fork, the elegant line of her wrist. I was cataloging her, just as she had catalogued me. The thought was disquieting. What was happening to me? This was Chloe's mother. A kind, beautiful, and presumably very straight, very married woman who had simply offered me refuge. I was projecting my own loneliness, my own fractured desires onto her. It was a classic, pathetic trope. The wounded lesbian falling for the first kind woman, who showed her a moment of grace. I had to stop. I had to build my walls back up, higher and thicker than before. After lunch, Chloe announced she had a series of work calls and disappeared into her father's study. The silence she left behind was heavy with unspoken things. I started clearing the plates, desperate for a task, a reason to move. "I can get those," Eleanor said from behind me. I nearly dropped a plate. "It's fine," I said quickly. "I'm happy to help. You're a guest, Maya." "I'm a long-term guest," I corrected, trying for a light tone and failing. I should earn my keep. I could feel her watching me as I moved to the sink. I turned on the water, the sound a welcome buffer. "You don't have to earn anything here," she said, her voice closer now. I glanced over my shoulder. She was leaning against the counter, her arms crossed, studying me with that same unnerving intensity. "This is a place to heal." Her words were kind, but they felt like a diagnosis. She saw my damage. The shame from the morning curdled with a fresh wave of humiliation. I didn't want her pity. "I'm not broken," I said, my voice sharp. I immediately regretted the defensiveness in my tone. Her expression softened. "I never said you were. But I know what it looks like to carry something heavy. You carry it in your shoulders." I stopped scrubbing the plate, my own posture suddenly feeling foreign to me. I hadn't realized how hunched I'd become, how I perpetually braced myself for a blow. She knew. She saw it all. She pushed off the counter and came to stand beside me at the sink, taking a dish towel from a hook. She didn't speak again, just took the wet plates from me as I washed them, her movements calm and efficient. We worked in silence, the only sounds the clink of ceramic and the running water. Her proximity was a physical weight, a warmth I could feel along the entire length of my arm. The scent of her, that lavender and green vine smell, was overwhelming. My mind, against my will, went back to the moment in the bedroom. The image of her still frame, her quiet gaze. It wasn't pity I had seen in her eyes. It was recognition. The days that followed fell into a strange, quiet rhythm. Chloe was often busy with work, leaving Eleanor and me to orbit each other in the silent house. The initial, excruciating awkwardness began to melt away, replaced by a tentative, fragile truce. We found a way to exist in the same space, a silent agreement to pretend the charged moment in the guest room had never happened, even as it hummed in the air between us constantly. She drew me into her world, slowly, gently. It started in the garden. One afternoon, I was sitting on the back porch, trying and failing to read the same page of a novel for the 20th time, when she came out with 2 glasses of iced tea. She set one on the small table beside me without a word, and then went to her knees in a bed of unruly rose bushes, her hands, protected by worn leather gloves, moving with expert precision. I watched her for a long time, the way the sun caught the silver in her hair, the focused line of her jaw as she pruned away the dead wood. She worked with a kind of fierce tenderness, a respect for the living things in her care that I found mesmerizing. "They're a bit dramatic, aren't they?" she said suddenly, not looking up from her task. Her voice startled me out of my reverie. "The roses?" She hummed. "They demand so much. The right sun, the right food, protection from pests. But when they bloom," she paused, snipping a withered brown cane with a satisfying crack. "It's worth the trouble." I felt a strange pang in my chest. It felt like she was talking about more than just flowers. The next day, she found me on the porch again. This time, she held out a spare pair of gloves. "The weeds are staging a coup in the vegetable patch," she said, a hint of dry humor in her tone. I could use an ally. I hesitated for only a second. The thought of being in such close proximity to her was daunting, but the thought of sitting alone with my own churning thoughts was worse. So I followed her out into the bright afternoon sun. We worked side by side, kneeling in the dark, rich soil. She showed me how to distinguish the tender young squash plants from the invasive bindweed, her fingers brushing mine as she pointed out the difference in the leaves. Each accidental touch was a small spark, a jolt that my body registered even if my mind tried to ignore it. We didn't talk much at first. The work was meditative, the rhythmic pulling and tossing of weeds a balm for my restless energy. But in the shared silence, a different kind of communication began to unfold. I learned the economy of her movements, the gentle way she handled the plants. I noticed a small, faded tattoo of a crescent moon on the inside of her wrist, visible only when her glove slipped down. I wondered about the woman who had gotten that tattoo, a woman who must have existed before she was Chloe's mother, before this house and this garden. Chloe tells me you're a writer, she said, her voice pulling me from my thoughts. I ripped a particularly stubborn thistle from the ground, dirt flying. I corrected. I'm between things right now, blocked, she asked, her tone gentle, without judgment. I shrugged, not wanting to get into the messy reality of it, that after Sasha, a fellow writer, had left, every word I tried to put on the page felt like a lie, a pale imitation of the feelings she had once inspired and then ruthlessly dismantled. Something like that. Eleanor was quiet for a moment, her trowel turning over the soil. I used to paint, she said softly. The admission hung in the air between us. I stopped weeding and looked at her. Her face was shaded by the brim of her straw hat, but I could see a flicker of something distant in her eyes. You did? A long time ago. Before Chloe. Before all this, she gestured vaguely at the house, the sprawling yard. I wasn't very good, but I loved it. The smell of the turpentine, the feel of the brush in my hand. Why did you stop? The question was out before I could stop it. It felt too personal, too forward. She didn't seem to mind. She looked at me, a wry, sad smile on her lips. Life, I suppose. A husband with a demanding career, a new baby. The canvases just started gathering dust in the attic. It became easier not to look at them. We fell silent again, but the quality of the silence had changed. It was heavier now, filled with the ghosts of abandoned passions. She had just handed me a piece of her past, a small, fragile truth. It felt like a gift. In that moment, kneeling in the dirt beside her, I felt a crack appear in the fortress I'd built around myself. She wasn't just Chloe's mother, a serene, untouchable figure. She was a woman who had, at some point, put her own dreams on a shelf. She understood what it meant to be between things. This shared, unspoken understanding felt more intimate than any conversation I'd had in years. I went back to pulling weeds, but now the work felt different. We weren't just two women tending a garden. We were two people, tending to the quiet, overgrown patches of each other's lives. The garden became our sanctuary, the place where the strictures of the house, the roles of host and guest, of mother and friend's daughter seemed to dissolve. In the humid afternoon air, surrounded by the scent of soil and blooming things, we were just Eleanor and Maya. Our conversations started to deepen, moving from the neutral territory of weather and plants to more personal terrain. She asked about my family, and I found myself telling her about my overbearing older sister, the one who thought my writing career was a cute hobby that I should give up for a real job. Eleanor listened without interruption, her expression thoughtful. When I finished, she simply said, "It's difficult when the people who are supposed to see you most clearly don't." The simple validation was like a balm on an old wound. In return, she shared stories of her own. She told me about growing up in a small coastal town, about her brief, wild stint living in the city as a young woman, working in a dusty old bookstore. She painted a picture of a life I could never have imagined for her, a life full of impulsive decisions and artistic ambitions. The more she revealed, the more the image of the placid, perfect matriarch fractured, replaced by someone far more complex and compelling. She was a woman of hidden depths, of quiet, unfulfilled longings. I felt an ache of recognition so profound it was almost painful. One evening, a summer storm rolled in, the sky turning a bruised purple-gray. The power flickered and died, plunging the house into a sudden, deep twilight. Chloe, who hated storms, immediately lit a dozen candles and retreated to her room with her laptop to work through it. Eleanor and I were left in the living room, the flickering candlelight casting long, dancing shadows on the walls. The rain lashed against the windows, a frantic, rhythmic drumming. "I always loved storms," Eleanor said, her voice soft in the sudden quiet. She was sitting in an armchair near the fireplace, a glass of red wine in her hand. "They make the house feel like a ship at sea." I was curled on the sofa, a blanket pulled over my lap. The enforced intimacy of the blackout was making my nerves hum. They always made me anxious as a kid, I admitted. I felt like the world was ending. Maybe it is, she said, a strange, wistful smile on her face. And a new one is beginning. She took a sip of her wine, her eyes finding mine over the rim of the glass. The candlelight caught in their depths, making them gleam. Tell me about her, Maya. The question was so direct, so unexpected, it stole the air from my lungs. There was no need to ask who her was. She knew. Of course, she knew. I had never said a word about Sasha, not to Chloe, not to Eleanor. But she had seen it in my posture, heard it in the silences between my words. She had seen the shape of the ghost I was carrying. My first instinct was to deflect, to pretend I didn't know what she was talking about. But looking at her, at the quiet patience in her face, the lie died on my lips. The storm outside, the candlelit darkness, the gentle inquiry in her voice, it all conspired to create a space of impossible safety. So I told her. I told her everything. I spoke about Sasha's brilliance, the way her mind moved, the way she could string words together that made the world feel sharper, more vibrant. I told her about our tiny apartment that was always filled with books and arguments and the smell of coffee. I told her how it felt to be loved by someone who saw the world as a story to be written, and how I had willingly become a character in hers. And then I told her how it ended. How Sasha's brilliance had a dark side, a cruelty that could cut you down without a second thought. How she had met someone else, a publisher who could do more for her career, and how she had discarded me like a rough draft, with a cool, clinical precision that had shattered me. The words poured out of me, a torrent I couldn't have stopped if I tried. I hadn't spoken about it to anyone, not really. I had given Chloe the sanitized, CliffsNotes version. But with Eleanor in the flickering dark, I gave her the whole ugly, beautiful, painful story. Throughout it all, she just listened. She didn't offer platitudes or easy comforts. She just sat there, her presence a steady, solid anchor in the storm of my own telling. When I finally fell silent, my voice hoarse and my cheeks wet with tears I hadn't even realized I was crying, she didn't move. She just watched me, her expression full of a deep, resonant empathy that went beyond mere pity. After a long moment, she set her wine glass down and came to sit on the edge of the sofa, not too close, but near enough that I could feel the warmth radiating from her. She didn't touch me. She just said, "Some people are wildfires. They are beautiful and dazzling to watch, but they burn down everything they touch. You were never meant to be kindling for someone else's fire, Maya." The metaphor was so perfect, so devastatingly accurate, it broke something open in my chest. I let out a sob, a raw, ragged sound that I had been holding in for months. And for the first time, I didn't feel ashamed of my own brokenness. In the warm, candlelit dark, with the storm raging outside, I felt seen. I felt understood. And I felt, for the first time in a very long time, a flicker of something that wasn't pain. That night was a turning point. A wall had been breached, a truth spoken aloud that could not be unsaid. The dynamic between us shifted, subtly but irrevocably. The polite distance was gone, replaced by a shared vulnerability. We started seeking out each other's company, no longer needing the pretense of gardening or household chores. We'd sit on the porch in the evenings, talking for hours as the fireflies began their nightly dance. I learned that her husband, a geologist, was on a year-long research assignment in Antarctica. She spoke of him with a quiet affection, but it was the affection one has for a respected colleague or a distant cousin, not the passionate love of a partner. There was a loneliness in her that mirrored my own, a quiet hum of solitude that ran beneath the surface of her calm exterior. I started to see the fine lines around her eyes not as signs of age, but as a map of a life lived with quiet resilience. I became obsessed with the small details of her. The way she tucked a stray strand of hair behind her ear. The low, musical hum she made when she was concentrating on a task. The scent of her skin after she'd been in the garden, a mix of lavender, soil, and sun. My awareness of her as a woman, separate from her role as Chloe's mother, became a constant, thrumming presence in my mind. It was a dangerous, thrilling current pulling me further and further from the safe shore of my self-imposed isolation. There were moments, small and fleeting, that were almost unbearable in their intensity. Almost moments. One afternoon, we were in the kitchen, canning the tomatoes from her garden. The air was thick with the sweet, acidic smell of stewing tomatoes and herbs. We worked in an easy, practiced rhythm, a domestic choreography we had developed over the weeks. I was reaching for a jar on a high shelf at the same time she was, our bodies turning towards each other in the narrow space between the counter and the island. My hand brushed against the soft cotton of her shirt, right over her stomach. She stopped, her own hand hovering in the air. We were suddenly, shockingly close. I could see the flecks of gold in her green eyes, could feel the heat of her breath on my cheek. The world seemed to narrow to the few inches of space between us. The bubbling of the pot on the stove was the only sound. My heart was a frantic drum against my ribs. I wanted to lean in. The desire was a physical force, a magnetic pull that I had to fight with every ounce of my willpower. Her gaze dropped to my mouth, just for a second, and in that second, I knew she felt it too. The air crackled, thick with unspoken possibilities. Then, from the other room, Chloe's voice called out, "Mom, have you seen my blue sweater?" The spell was broken. Eleanor took a sharp breath and stepped back, her composure sliding back into place like a mask. "I think it's in the laundry room," she called back, her voice remarkably steady. She wouldn't look at me. She turned back to the jars, her movements suddenly brisk, almost businesslike. I stood frozen for a moment, my hand still tingling where it had touched her. It was no longer a question of if I was falling for her. I was already in a free fall, and the ground was rushing up to meet me. The only question was whether she would be there to catch me, or if I was about to shatter all over again. The tension in the house became a living entity. It coiled in the quiet hallways, settled over the dinner table, and hummed between us in every shared glance. Chloe remained blissfully oblivious, her world consumed by work deadlines and gossip from her city friends. Her presence was a constant reminder of the impossibility of my feelings. This was her mother. The woman who had packed her school lunches and kissed her scraped knees. The transgression felt enormous, a betrayal of the friendship and sanctuary I had been so freely given. I started to pull away, retreating back to the safety of my room. I told myself it was for the best, that I needed to sever this connection before it grew into something that could destroy everything. I would answer Eleanor's gentle questions with monosyllables. I would busy myself with my laptop whenever she entered a room. I was trying to rebuild my walls, but it was like trying to build a dam with sand. Every time I saw her, every time she smiled at me with that quiet, knowing look in her eyes, the walls crumbled. She didn't push. She simply watched me, her patience a silent testament to her strength. She let me have my space, but her presence was a constant, gentle pressure, a reminder of the vulnerability we had shared. One afternoon, my sister called. The sound of her voice, sharp and critical, was like a splash of cold water. "So, are you ever coming back to the real world, Maya?" she began, without any preamble. "Or are you just going to hide out in the woods forever? You need to get a job. You need to start dating again. Maybe find a nice, stable man this time." The words were like tiny, poisoned darts. A nice, stable man, it was her go-to solution for all my problems, a complete and utter erasure of who I was. The conversation devolved from there, a familiar dance of her unsolicited advice, and my simmering resentment. I ended the call feeling raw and exposed, the old shame coiling in my gut. I felt like a fraud, hiding in this beautiful, quiet house, harboring impossible feelings for my best friend's mother while my own family saw me as a project to be fixed. I fled to the one place that felt safe, the garden. I sank down onto the small stone bench hidden behind the tall sunflowers, pulling my knees to my chest. The carefully constructed composure I had been fighting to maintain shattered. I let my head fall into my hands and finally cried. Not the quiet, dignified tears I had shed with Eleanor during the storm, but ugly, gasping sobs of frustration and loneliness and a desperate, hopeless yearning for a life that felt like my own. I didn't hear her approach. I only knew she was there when I felt a gentle hand on my back. I flinched, startled, and looked up through my tear-streaked vision. Eleanor was standing over me, her face etched with concern. In her hand, she held a single, perfect white rose, its petals still dewy. She didn't ask what was wrong. She just sat down on the bench beside me, her presence solid and comforting. She laid the rose gently in my lap. From the defiant ones, she said softly, a nod to our first conversation about the dramatic flowers. I stared at the rose, its delicate beauty a stark contrast to the ugliness I felt inside. I took a shuddering breath, trying to pull myself together. "I'm sorry," I whispered. "You shouldn't have to see me like this, Maya," she said, her voice firm but gentle. She waited until I looked at her. "There is no part of you I am not willing to see." Her words struck me with the force of a physical blow. It was a declaration. An acceptance. It was everything I had been terrified to hope for. The space between us, once filled with unspoken tension, was now charged with a new, terrifying clarity. She was offering me a safety I had never known, a place where I didn't have to hide any part of myself. The storm of my own making, the one I had been running from for months, finally stilled. All that was left was the quiet, undeniable truth of the woman sitting next to me. I looked at her, really looked at her, in the golden late afternoon light. I saw the map of her life in the lines around her eyes, the strength in her hands that had tended this garden into being, the profound, unwavering kindness in her gaze. The fear that had been my constant companion for so long, fear of being hurt again, fear of wanting too much, fear of being seen, and found wanting, began to recede. In its place, something new and fragile began to bloom. Hope. She held my gaze, her own eyes searching mine. The world fell away. There was no Chloe, no sister, no ghost of Sasha. There was only the stone bench, the smell of damp earth and roses, and the woman who had seen me at my most exposed and had not turned away. I didn't know what would happen next, what this meant for either of us. All I knew was that I couldn't rebuild the walls anymore. I didn't want to. Slowly, hesitantly, I reached out and took her hand. Her fingers, calloused from her work in the garden, curled around mine, a perfect, solid fit. It wasn't a fire. It was a quiet, steady warmth, a promise of shelter from the storm. And for the first time, I felt like I was finally, truly home. Her thumb stroked the back of my hand, a small, deliberate movement that sent a cascade of warmth through my entire body. We sat in silence for a long time, the only sound the buzz of a late bee and the distant cry of a hawk circling overhead. The sun began to dip below the valley ridge, painting the sky in fiery strokes of orange and pink. It was a silence not of awkwardness but of profound understanding. A threshold had been crossed. "My husband. Robert," she said, her voice a low murmur, as if she were speaking a foreign language. "We have an arrangement. A partnership. It's been that way for a long time. We care for each other, but we live separately, even when we are in the same house." She didn't need to say more. I understood the years of quiet compromise, of gentle affection that had long since replaced passion. She was giving me the final piece of the puzzle, the one that allowed me to let go of the last vestiges of guilt. She was not a woman to be stolen, she was a woman who was free to choose. She turned to face me fully on the bench, her other hand coming up to cup my jaw. Her touch was impossibly gentle. Her thumb brushed away the last of my tears. "I have not felt seen," she said, her voice thick with emotion, "in a very long time. Until you, and then the dam broke." The carefully contained longing, the weeks of stolen glances and charged silences and almost moments, all of it crested into a single, inevitable wave. She leaned in, slowly, giving me every opportunity to pull away. I didn't. I leaned in to meet her, my eyes fluttering closed. Her lips were soft, tentative at first, a question. They tasted of iced tea and something uniquely her, something green and alive. I answered with a soft sigh, my hand tightening on hers. The kiss deepened, no longer a question but a statement. It was a kiss of profound relief, of homecoming. It wasn't the desperate, frantic passion I had known with Sasha. It was slow and deep and sure. It was a conversation that our bodies were having, one that our words had been circling for weeks. It was the quiet unfolding of a truth that had been hiding in plain sight all along. When we finally broke apart, we were both breathless. She rested her forehead against mine, her eyes still closed. "Maya," she whispered, and my name on her lips was a prayer. We walked back to the house as dusk settled, hand in hand, in a dreamlike state. The world felt both exactly the same and irrevocably altered. Chloe was still on her video call, her cheerful, professional voice drifting from behind the closed study door, a sound from another universe. Eleanor led me not to the living room or the kitchen, but up the stairs, past my own room, to a door at the end of the hall I had never seen open. It was her studio. The room was filled with the ghosts of her former life. Canvases, covered in white sheets, were stacked against the walls. A dusty easel stood in the corner like a lonely sentinel. The air smelled faintly of turpentine and linseed oil, a scent trapped in time. She didn't turn on the light, letting the deep blue of the twilight filter through the large dormer window. "I haven't been in here for years," she said, her voice hushed with a kind of reverence. She moved to the window, looking out at the darkening garden. I came to stand behind her, wrapping my arms around her waist, resting my chin on her shoulder. She leaned back against me, her body fitting against mine as if it were made to be there. We stood like that for a long time, watching the first stars appear in the indigo sky. There were a million questions to be asked, 1,000 logistical problems to be solved. What would we tell Chloe? What would happen when her husband returned? What would my life look like now? But in that moment, none of it mattered. All that mattered was the solid feel of her in my arms, the steady beat of her heart against my back, and the quiet promise of this new, terrifying, beautiful world we had just stepped into together. She had seen all of me, and I had seen all of her. And in that shared seeing, we had found not a wildfire, but a garden, a place where something new and resilient could finally grow. The next morning, I woke up in my own bed, but the world was new. The sunlight filtering through the curtains seemed brighter. The birdsong outside the window sounded like a symphony. The ghost of Eleanor's kiss was still on my lips. I went downstairs, my heart a nervous, joyful flutter. She was in the kitchen, a mug of coffee in her hands, staring out the window at the garden. She wore a soft, cashmere robe, and her hair was loose around her shoulders. She looked younger, softer, than I had ever seen her. She heard me enter and turned, a slow, beautiful smile spreading across her face. It was a smile just for me. "Good morning," she said, her voice a low caress. "Morning," I whispered back. There was a beat of shy silence, the newness of it all settling between us. Then she set her mug down on the counter and walked over to me. She took my face in her hands and gave me a soft, lingering kiss. It was a kiss of confirmation, a promise that the night before had been real. When she pulled back, her eyes were shining. "I have something for you," she said. She led me to the sunroom, a space at the back of the house that was usually filled with overflowing houseplants. But now, it was different. In the corner, cleared of all the clutter, stood the old, dusty easel from her studio. Beside it, on a small table, was a brand new, stretched canvas. And next to that, a set of my own. She had found the box of my old writing journals and pens that I'd tucked away, a painful reminder of a life I thought was over. She had set up 2 chairs, facing each other. An invitation. A plan. "We can start again," she said simply. Together it wasn't a grand, dramatic gesture. It was something better. It was a concrete action, a quiet, shared commitment to reclaiming the parts of ourselves we had lost. It was the beginning of a new story, one we would write and paint together. The logistics of the future were still a tangled, complicated mess waiting for us. But right now, in the quiet morning light, with the promise of a blank canvas and an empty page, none of that mattered. We had found each other. We would figure out the rest. So how many times do we convince ourselves that a quiet, comfortable life is enough, only to discover that the one thing we truly need is the one thing we were most afraid to want? If you've ever had to choose between the safety of the shore and the terror of the open sea, like this story, subscribe for more, and let me know in the comments what you would have done.